All right, if everybody would take their seats, and the members have had an opportunity to discuss the three papers they heard this morning, and we now have a questions and answers session, and our three speakers, Conor, Laura and Joseph, are there to answer questions. And you'll observe there are mics around the room, so we'll take the questions. And as Sharon said at the start, it would accommodate Joseph if Joseph's questions were taken first. So could we deal with it on that basis?
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for table number 12. I have a number of questions, but conscious of your requirement to put the questions to Joseph Curtin first, I'll take them in that order. There are two other citizens at the table who would also like to put questions to the panel.
Right.
I just need to check if they have any in particular for Joseph.
Yeah, all right.
Any of you got a question? Okay, well, one of the questions from a citizen at this table is regarding the why is there such a lack of investment in wave energy in this country? And that would also apply, a similar question applies to the rail infrastructure in this country.
Thank you for the questions. Wave energy is not at the level of technological maturity that something like wind power would be at. And actually, wave energy is very highly correlated to wind power. So when it tends to be windy, it tends to be wavy. And we actually already have a technology, therefore, to capture that resource, which would be much more cost effective than wave energy. But that's not to say that wave energy won't, at some stage in the future, be economically viable. And SEAI, in fact, are investing a lot of money into R&D, because that's where wave is at. It's at the research and development stage, not the technological deployment stage. In terms of the rail, I'm not an expert, but I would say that Ireland has quite a dispersed population settlement, and therefore I agree with you, actually, first of all, that I think we should be investing more in our rail infrastructure. But the economics are challenging because of the population density issues, and that probably explains why there's been a reluctance to invest. But again, I do think that I very strongly think that we need to rebalance our capital expenditure budget towards public transport. At the moment, we're spending 2/3 of our capital, the proportion of our capital budget for transport goes on roads and maintaining roads and building new roads. And that's completely, in my view, incompatible with a country that aspires to be carbon neutral or to achieve rapid decarbonisation.
Yes. Very good. Laura, would you like to make any observation on that?
On the rail, I don't have an expertise in the other area. Just on the rail transportation, it is an issue of the dispersed population, and certainly what we've spoken to people in the rail sector, and a lot of the issue is, yes, you can use rail for point to point, so say Cork to Dublin for freight, etc. But then there's a significant cost then when you transport out particular freight out from those points.
Yes, very good. Any other question for Joseph? We'll come back to your table in due course.
I'm the facilitator for table 5. The citizens have a number of questions. Is there a plan with the help of the EU to help Ireland meet our targets and not just monetary penalties if we don't meet them? Second one is, how do New Zealand, a similar country in size to Ireland, deal with their agricultural pollution? Third one, and this is a question for Joseph and the panel. Can we reverse the damage already caused by global warming, or is it purely a damage limitation exercise?
Thank you for the excellent questions. The first one, there are EU funding streams both for research and for projects of common interest, for example. So in other words, an interconnector between Ireland, an electricity interconnector between Ireland and France, for example. Those kinds of projects get funding from the likes of the European Bank, the EIB? European Investment Bank, yeah, thanks, Laura. No, but I would say that the EU can also be the source of some of our problems. So if you look at something like the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, this is a policy which incentivizes us to do, which drives us towards a certain type of agricultural development. And then the climate policy under the EU drives us towards a completely different set of answers. So some of these problems, no doubt, need to be sorted out at the EU level. But yes, the EU certainly does direct a lot of its instruments towards enabling decarbonisation in member states. Good question about New Zealand. New Zealand has different governments, just like Ireland has different governments, and different governments have taken different views. So there was, about 10 or 15 years ago, the New Zealanders announced the intention to set up an emissions trading scheme which would include their agricultural sector, but that never happened. The big difference between New Zealand and Ireland is that Ireland is part of the EU, and so therefore Ireland has legally binding targets. Under the Paris Accord, which New Zealand is a party to, all it is required to do is make voluntary pledges and then to bring forward more ambitious pledges over time, in theory. And to be very honest with you, what countries who are in that situation, small countries, big countries don't get away with it because everybody is looking at them, but small countries can get away with not doing as much, not dealing with their intractable issues. Ireland doesn't, unfortunately, have that comfort zone. It's not fair, but that's actually the way it is at the moment. So I would say that New Zealand is taking a similar approach to Ireland on its agricultural sector at the moment, but it doesn't have the same implications for New Zealand as it would for Ireland, if that makes sense. I'll leave the last question to the other panelists.
Yeah. Yes. Conor?
Rather than what we can do to reverse the warming trend, there is what we call an inertia in the climate system, in that greenhouse gases that already have been emitted have yet to transform, I guess, into an increase in warming. So even if we stopped greenhouse gas emissions right now, we would still expect continuation of that warming trend into the future. In terms of the future emission scenarios that we use, none of them show a decrease in global mean temperature over the course of this century. Some people put forward the potential for things like geoengineering or to remove carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but in many cases they're pie in the sky. There are serious ethical questions about how we do that, and we've seen from weather modification in the past how limited they can be in success.
Any other question for Joe? Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
My name's Mike, sorry. I'm a citizen at table 5. I just wanted to ask 3 questions. The first 2 are from the entire table, and the third one is of my own writing.
Yes.
Firstly, this morning we heard a lot about targets, long-term targets for 2020, 2030 and 2050. And we were wondering if to focus the minds of short-sighted politicians and help all citizens keep touch with the issues at hand, could we use, to much greater extent, short-term targets that joined up the dots with the longer-term targets? So you could have annual targets or 5-yearly targets that must be met, and also coupled with that, real and serious sanctions if they're not met. And then maybe a politician might look shorter than the 5-year plan or the next election or whatever. That's the first question. And then the second question is there a danger when you're looking at things from a point of view of adaptation strategies and mitigation strategies, is there a danger that politicians may use the adaptation strategies as a manner or a means to water down mitigation plans or actions?
To water down mitigation.
Yeah, is there a danger that one is played off the other by politicians so that you put greater effort, for example, in asking us to use factor 50 and telling us to protect our skin, or should we actually stop fossil fuel burning in the fuel stations, power stations? You can use one against the other, whereas what we're actually hearing, what should be done, is both. And my final question is, does the panel think that there would be any merit in a constitutional change for environmental protection, such as a stewardship obligation for this country, which might keep politicians also honest if it was embedded in the Constitution.
Yeah. Very good.
Because that last question is my question as opposed to the table.
Yeah, that's your question, yeah. Very good. And I think we'll be probably visiting that again.
Yeah, but I would like to hear their opinion on that question as well.
Yeah, all right. We'll start with Joseph.
Yeah, I think, again, all the questions have been really spot on and brilliant, so really kind of interesting discussion. Targets, short and long term. So if you have a short-term target and it's legally binding, it can be subject to fluctuation. So for example, if your economy grows particularly faster than expected or slower than expected, it can have a kind of an impact. In fact, we do have targets every year under our current legislation, but we can borrow from one year to another. So it kind of allows for that flexibility without binding us to achieving a specific thing at one point in time. Also, government under the new low carbon development plan must report to the Dáil every year on their progress on climate change, and I think that's really important, and it has the potential to keep governments focused in the shorter term. But I think it's a brilliant question about the balance between shorter and longer term targets. Adaptation and mitigation, again, very insightful question. A lot of people who don't want to do anything on climate change, the new climate denial, if you like, is, oh, well, let's just adapt. You know, we acknowledge it's happening now, we acknowledge that there's a major problem, but it's really costly to do anything about it, so let's just adapt. So those two things are very much played off each other in immature democracies, particularly like the United States, for example.
Yeah, very good. Laura?
I don't want to repeat what Joe's saying. We do have annual targets and annual obligations. I think because actions and policies take time, you do need a combination of the long term and the short term, and certainly what we've been focusing on is trying to look at both, but I would have to say looking to 2050 and saying this is the ultimate vision now, here are the steps and how we get there would be something that we'd be promoting. Because so rather than just looking at it year on year, having that combination of saying, well, what are the obligations now? But we do have annual targets. And there is sanction if you don't, at an EU level, if you don't comply. With regard to adaptation mitigation, that it is two sides of the same coin. We need to do both. You can't do one or the other. I'd have to say personally, I haven't heard much talk of we'll adapt rather than kind of will mitigate.
Yeah.
In fact, when you see the floods, that's when people really start focusing on, and it's just one example, but people really do start focusing and saying, God, we need to do things now. So I think when we have serious issues that are not, there's a climate element to them like floods, it focuses the mind on mitigation as well as adaptation. With regard to constitutional obligation, other countries do have it. I don't want to kind of say I think it's we should, but other countries have it, and I'd have to say countries like Sweden will be seen as leaders in this area, and that there's actually national kind of obligations there. And it is a way of ensuring that environmental protection is enshrined in what we do at a governmental level.
Conor, what's your view?
I very much agree with the points on planning timescales, on the tensions between adaptation and mitigation. It's been shown that, and particularly by the Stern report, which is an economic appraisal of what if we just put our eggs in the basket of adaptation, that it proves far more costly than mitigating or reducing greenhouse gases. I think the point that we have to see them as being two sides of the same coin are extremely important. I hope from my talk this morning, I emphasize that point, that even if we do limit warming globally to 2 degrees, we still need to adapt, and that there are impacts that will be felt, that will change the occurrence of extreme events that we have to deal with, both here in Ireland in the context of flooding and internationally, particularly in the context of heat stress at lower latitudes. I haven't thought about the issue of constitutional change, I must confess, but I would agree with Laura's point that if you think back about the history of our Constitution when it was written. We have come to recognise far more of how interconnected our economy is with our environment, of how interconnected human well-being is with environmental well-being. And I think we do need to think about that, of how we place that in terms of not just the social contract of our expectations of government, but more formally in terms of, how do we formalise our expectations and our requirements around these issues.
Very good, thank you.
In terms of what I was asking, could I just add one more bit? What I'm hearing answers part of the question, but the sanctions side of it, I keep on harping on about trying to keep the politicians in line, like I was talking about a bunch of children, but sometimes they operate like that. The actual sanctions required, is it possible on the short-term targets to actually have sanctions that are generated internally within Ireland, as opposed to relying on the EU in 10 years' time to smack someone's wrists?
The UK climate...
Because it's a race from what I can see, and we need to keep on point, if you know what I mean.
The UK climate legislation does have those kinds of legally binding national targets. It's difficult, one, to say that I suppose that a system is going to impose fines on itself. It's a little bit of a circular argument, and so under the UK legislation, they don't impose fines, but there is a legally binding kind of obligation. So, and I'm not quite sure, you would probably need to discuss with our chair what the exact legal situation is, or how that would play out if it was ever brought to court, because it's a difficult one, I think. I'm really sorry. I have to, if I'm going to have any chance of making my wedding, not my wedding, but I really have to head. I'm really sorry. I'm very much enjoying the discussion, but thank you very much. I have to run.
Thank you very much, Joseph. We go back. Yes, we'll go back and take the
It's Dave on table 12. Question for both Laura and Conor. The poor old cow has taken an awful lot of flack, and I see everybody made reference to it in their presentations as well. I was listening on the radio a while ago that a Professor Luke O'Neill was saying that there's a type of seaweed that has been shown that when dried up and added to cattle's feed, that it practically eliminates the methane producing elements of their gases, which basically, to me, that is a solution to one of the problems of climate change, global warming and all that, emissions. The heading of the meeting is how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change. Although there's only been 3 presentations this morning, I've heard nothing about what we're doing to change. It's all about what needs to be done, what needs to be done. That's all you ever hear, it's what needs to be done. There is a solution there. Now, okay, granted, over time it has to be proven, big scale, but there is a solution there. So as to make ourselves a leader in climate change, can we not, as well as saying we have to do this, we have to do that, but we've come up with this solution here and it works. And this makes, because we rely so heavily on cattle within this country, it's such a big industry. But we can actually turn around as on a global stage and say, listen, we've changed, we've found this solution, we've enacted this solution, and look, it's working. We've reduced our greenhouse gases. So would it not be, especially say for the likes of the EPA and all that, it's your job to let us know what it is that's damaging the environment. Would it not be good to throw in the odd plus sign as well? This is a solution. This is a success. And that in itself, to show that there's the successes there and the solutions come up, and when they do come up, we enact them, we enforce them, and it works. That in itself will be an incentive for people to turn and go, yeah, that actually, maybe I will put me cardboard in the green bin today instead of the waste bin. Do you know what I mean? So, but like I said, it's just that solution is there. You never hear about it. Never heard about it. So just what do you think of that?
Yeah. Would we start with the cows and the seaweed?
Start with the cows and the seaweed. I think it's a very important point, because what it leads on to is the importance of research.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount being invested actually in Ireland. The EPA does funds some research in this area, but actually the Department of Agriculture, Teagasc, doing an awful lot of work identifying that this is such a big issue for Ireland. What are potential solutions? And part of it is about the genomics, what type of cows, different breeds release different amount of emissions, etc. And I'm not an expert. I would say that they are looking into that. And also then looking at what type of feed, because that has a big impact as well. So there is research being done, and I think what you're alluding to is there is this, and it's back to this opportunity. If we do the research, we actually identify solutions, and there's an opportunity also to highlight those to other areas and to other countries. So it is being done, but it is a continuous evolution of looking into that into more detail, so we actually can come up with, I don't think we're going to have one solution. It tends to be, there's no one silver bullet here. There tends to be a combination of things. With regard to identifying the things that are done, I would say the part of our role is around, it's called resource efficiency, but it links into climate. So it's water, waste, energy. And we do it tends to be at quite a sectoral level. So you would work with, for example, the hotel sector and say, okay, this is a sector that actually ends up having high energy bills, water, a lot of water, which also impacts on climate. What can that sector do to reduce its emissions and also save money? The other area that we're working with, and we've got a joint programme with the agriculture sector, it's actually called smart farming. And what it's looking at is there's 139,000 farms across the country, and we've, working with the IFA, Teagasc and others, there's an educational programme for farmers of things they can do now that will save them money and also help protect the environment, which again has a climate aspect. And actually where we had originally identified savings of around €5,000 a farm per annum, which is a significant saving, we've now identified through the work with the farmers is actually around €8,000 per farm. So there's an economic benefit as well as an environmental benefit. So you're absolutely right to highlight it, but there are things happening on the ground, also working with the health sector and others, but time is moving on.
Yeah, just to say, we've been talking about the programme for the next weekend, and I think agriculture is going to feature there. So we'll go into that in greater detail. Conor?
Yeah, I don't think I can add much more than Laura has said. Just to emphasise that point about how important research is in terms of identifying these potential mitigation options. Again, no one solution fits all or deals with everything, but we can make Ireland a leader in terms of the kinds of research innovations, linking with industry, exporting that across the world.
I'm sure some of the members, like me, since they got interested in this, have noticed that ExxonMobil are getting very much into seaweed. Did you notice that? They have ads on some of the television channels indicating their interest in it. Anyway.
Hi, I just had a question. It was based on something that Joseph said in his presentation around resilience and just Ireland's resilience, and he noted that Ireland would be quite resilient in the face of climate change by comparison with other regions of the world. And I just wondered, in terms of things like our dependency on energy imports and food imports, how resilient would Ireland be, would you say, in the event of even a 2-degree increase in global temperatures?
Resilience is an important topic, I guess. It concerns how able we are to deal with change and to maintain how our systems and how we function. We have seen from recent extreme events that we are not often as resilient as we might expect. The presentations that particularly talked about vulnerability being greatest in developing countries, but even when we come to developed countries, we can also see where resilience needs to be improved. If you take one of the richest cities in the world, New York, and the effect that Hurricane Sandy had, if you take the flood events that happened here in the Shannon, they emphasize points of weakness within our systems. At 2 degrees, we do have issues that we need to deal with in terms of our national resilience. If the point I made about dry summer in 1995 affected agricultural exports, affected water resources. Even at 2 degrees, those kind of extreme events become more frequent. So there's real work to be done in terms of understanding the resilience of critical infrastructure, but also of communities, because it's often, even with flood events now, it's the poorest who suffer the most and don't have the resources or access to credit to rebuild.
And just if
Yes,
I might
yes,
come
Laura.
very quickly, the flood is what we tend to, when we think about climate change, we think about impact, we think about flood, and it is a really important one, but it's not the only one. And I think we need to just be conscious of that, in that there are potential health impacts, there's, impacts on growing seasons, all of these things as well. And one of the things, and I know you've an awful lot to read, but we've recently produced a very short document, which is the summary of impacts of climate change on Ireland. It's slightly more than 2 pages, but we can. I think we can certainly send it on to the Secretariat, because what it highlights is, yes, flooding is important, but also things like insurance and just lots of small things that actually add up to the impact on Ireland as well.
Well, I would love if you would send it on to the Sec, and we'll put it up on the website, and you can read it. The members can read it. I think that would be very useful. Yes.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for Table 7, and I have 2 questions. The first one is from one of the citizens at the table, and it's for Laura, and the second question is to both of you, and it's from everybody at the table. Laura, this is for you. The clarification of the meaning carbon neutral and why it only applies to agriculture. And the second question, if you were in charge, what's the one change you would implement? That's to both of you.
I don't mean to laugh, but carbon neutrality is such a subject of debate of what does it mean in agriculture, because we now have this aspiration, and this is a topic I think that'll be really interesting for your discussion on agriculture. We have this aspiration to approach carbon neutrality, but probably everybody has a slightly different view of what it means, and what we need is clarification, and actually to decide as a country, what does that mean? Presumably you take the emissions from agriculture, but also, for example, peatland can be a sink, forests are a sink. How you balance those out? But we don't have a definition of carbon neutrality, and we do need one. With regard to the one thing I'd do if I was in charge, I'd have to say that I think decarbonising of our public transport fleet is critical. The reason I say it is twofold. First of all, the technology is there and it can be done, so it's moving. It's like this is there, and also I think our public transport needs to be a leader in this area, so that it encourages work across other sectors, and a private sector included. And I look, and I've mentioned Sweden already. I was over in Sweden 10 years ago, I think, at this stage, and all of their public transport fleet was on biogas, but that also meant that biogas was available at all the local garages, etc., for private fleet. So it created an economy of scale in that instance that would then be able to, I suppose, spread out across society. Now, I'm not necessarily saying now that biogas is the solution or whatever is the solution, but I think if you move the public transport fleet to fossil-free, it has so many benefits, because it's health benefits as well. But that's my one that I would say.
Yeah, I think it's more to step back a bit and to actually get real about meeting our international targets and commitments. I think having the political will, or building the political will to actually do that fundamentally, is the most important thing we need to do. After that, it's about equality across different sectors, about responsibility from public transport to residential to agriculture. All have a role to play, but getting real about meeting those targets in the first instance.
Very good. Thank you. We're getting a bit. I'll take one more question, I think.
Hi, I'm the facilitator for Table 2, and the citizens have asked me to ask the question. It's kind of a two-part on this one. What research is there on re-establishing peat bogs as carbon sinks? And is this national peat bog the most efficient use of the land as a carbon sink? And then just one other question about the EU emissions scheme. How much has Ireland bought as a country, or through industry, or as a nation? Thank you.
Just on the how much has Ireland bought, I would genuinely hand up, I don't know, but the department love me for saying this, but the department are here this afternoon, and it is actually, it's a government I'm aware that nothing has been bought in a significant long time ago, but I think in the climate, in the Celtic Tiger era there was some bought, but I just genuinely don't know the amount. With regard to research on peat bogs, yes, and back to the EPA-funded research, significant research has been done on re-establishing peat bogs and the opportunity to do that. And there can be win-win on that, because it also, back to everything is connected, yes, they're carbon sinks, but also it gives an opportunity for more biodiversity in those areas as well. And in fact can be tourist attractions, so it can be very much a win-win with regard to the peat bogs. But again, if you want to look on our website there, you can have a look at the research, but it has been done, and there is also examples, and I know, for example, the Port Nimona have re-established some of their peat bogs as well, and it's been very successful.
And I would just add one point to that is in terms of restoration of natural ecosystems like our peatland is also a very effective natural flood risk reduction process. So it deals with one of the impacts as well as an adaptation measure as well as a mitigation measure.
But we can't stay there, but I'll take one more. I'll take one more.
Mary.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, George. Might I sneak in 2 quick questions on behalf of the citizens of this table? One is from Connor, and it's by way of a clarification, and the second one is for Laura, which is a follow-up to a clarification she gave to a citizen at this table. Connor, was it correct from your presentation that to understand that the deforestation of the Amazon basin is not contributing to climate change? And the question for Laura is, why is the public subsidy for peat 3 times that of wind? Thank you.
I could go first, please. That question is extremely pertinent at this moment, because there's actually a paper out in Nature, which is a big scientific outlet, on exactly this point recently. One of the problems we're concerned about in terms of how carbon is sequestered or stored or taken out of the atmosphere is through the role of tropical forests. And we have seen large-scale amounts of deforestation across the tropics, which is decreasing the resilience of those forests and reducing the role that they play in naturally taking carbon out of the atmosphere. We have concerns additionally now that not just deforestation, but degradation of the well-being of ecosystems is also decreasing the ability of those forests to act as a natural carbon store. And indeed, when we think about the impacts of climate change in the future, increased drought events also weaken the resilience of those stores. So one of the feedback processes we're concerned about in the future is that as warming increases, as human activity, deforestation degrades and destructs some of those environments, that we get an amplification of warming. So very much tropical rainforests are very much part of the natural system and one we're concerned about.
With regard to why is the subsidy for peat so much higher than wind, I suppose that's an energy policy, and the why I can't definitively say to you. I would expect there's historical aspects to it, which is around issues of security of supply at one stage, issues of socio-economic and supporting employment in the Midlands, and that would have been the reasoning why. But as I said, it's like I don't want to say it's not an area of expertise, but I'd be kind of making suppositions rather than being able to give you a definitive answer on it.
Yeah. Very good. Well, we've had a very, very interesting morning. I want to thank our 3 speakers. I hope Joseph has an enjoyable afternoon. But I'm very, very grateful to all of the speakers, and we've had a very, very interesting morning. Thank you very much. It's great.